Today, it's my great pleasure to talk to you about the federal STEM plan, strategic plan for STEM, and to kind of give you some highlights about it and also give you some of my thoughts about what's going on here that might help the work that you're doing or that we're all doing in terms of STEM education, both in formal and informal ways. So I'm going to give a little background about the plan, where it came from, how it got built, and then talk through the various components of the plan, and then talk a little bit about what I found kind of interesting and unusual about the plan, and then open up for questions, and we'll go from there. So the plan was released on December 4th, 2018 at a ceremony in the White House, and it's called Charting a Course for Success, Americans' Strategy for STEM Education. So first of all, where does this plan come from? This is actually part of something called the America's Competes Act, Reauthorization Act, which is a giant bill that actually, among other things, sets the authorizations for funding for many of the science agencies, particularly NSF and others. But it also has components in it that Congress has added to help keep a coherence discussion going on at the federal level for all of the science agencies and what they're doing. So one of the requirements of the Competes Act was the development of a 5-year strategic plan for STEM education. So this is the federal plan for STEM education, and more on that in a minute. That's an important piece of knowledge, or important thing to know. The last one was done 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it turns out, under the Obama administration. And this is the first version that's coming out under the Trump administration. The plan itself is to really try to add some coherency amongst all of the activity that the federal agencies, many of them, are doing in science and in science education. And it's very much a kind of a aspirational plan, but then there's also after this statements of work and work plans that come from all of the agencies involved. If you want to get the plan, here's the URL. You can go to the White House website, and if you type all this stuff in, or just type in STEM strategic plan, you'll find it. And I would encourage you to do that. It's actually a pretty interesting plan. I will see how long it takes to get to the next slide.
I think I'll just do it for you, Rob.
Yeah, why don't you? Okay.
Be impatient.
So let's talk about where this plan came from. Basically, it took about a year to develop. It was based on a lot of discussions, listening meetings that were held. It was run out of the Office of Science Technology Policy in the White House, and was actually driven by the STEM education person who came from Iowa, had done the state work, and joined the administration for a year to work on developing this plan. There were lots of listening sessions with many, many different organizations. There was a state federal STEM education summit that happened in June before the plan was developed. It came, as I said, out of the Office of Science Technology Policy. What's important to know then is that there's also input that came from something called the Federal STEM Advisory Committee. And that committee is a committee that I'm on, which has 18 people from around the country, from all kinds of walks of life in the STEM education world, at universities, K-12, museums, in school, out of school, and formal. And this committee was also mandated by Congress to sort of hold the federal government's feet to their fire in terms of the outcomes of the plan. So it's really an advisory plan, and our job is actually technically not to write the plan, not to implement the plan, but to make sure that it's getting done. And so we're going to actually have meetings to see how the outcomes are followed, whether they're making progress, et cetera. And again, it was a congressional mandated advisory panel that was designed to sort of keep Congress, who is very interested in this work, appraised of what the federal government is doing. We also had input into the plan, but we weren't involved in writing it. We should just comment on what was there. Let's go to the next slide. One of the interesting things about this is that this plan is part of something called the National Science Technology Council, and a subset of that, that's in the White House, and that's really the heads of all of the science agencies that are involved in the federal government. And a subset of that is something called CoSTEM, or really the STEM education part of that. And that's the group that, that actually implements the plan and coordinates all these agencies. And there's 16 agencies in the federal government that actually is involved in some way or other with science and science education. And you can see the logos up here. Obviously, some of them we know, like NSF and NOAA and NASA, for example, but there's also Department of Agriculture. There's also the EPA. There's also NIST. There's also Department of the Interior, Department of Defense. All of these agencies, it turns out, do science, and many of them actually do science education in ways, sometimes I discovered a bunch of things I didn't know. Also, the Department of Education is involved with this. So this plan was actually written by writers from each of these groups. They had a stable of 40 writers who wrote the plan, and they wrote it in a matter of months, which is kind of extraordinary in its own way. Let's go to the next slide. So what's in the plan? I'll give you the highlights about it. And there's sort of vision highlights. There's then something called pathways. And in the pathways, there are certain specific branches of the pathways, if you want. And those are the kinds of things I want to talk with you about. First, to look at the vision, the goals are really quite broad. All Americans will have lifelong access to high quality STEM education, and the United States will be a global leader in STEM literacy, innovation, and employment. So what's kind of interesting at this level is, notice some interesting words here: lifelong, also literacy, innovation, and employment. The notion is really quite broad, and if you see the three vision statement goals here, they're pretty all-encompassing. Build strong foundations for STEM literacy. That's literacy for adults, kids, everyone. It's really science people, non-science people. This is not a plan that's designed for only pipeline academics or something like this, or only K-12. It's everybody. Second, prepare the STEM workforce for the future. This administration has come into office with a very strong emphasis on workforce development, and the plan actually shows a lot of that in the mix of the activities they're asking for. So this is not just a K-12 education plan, this is really a plan about workforce. And the third is increase in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's a very strong emphasis on that as being a primal piece of the work, a realization that that's the way that not only is an important thing to do from a populist point of view and from an employment point of view, it's actually the only way that we'll get the workforce that's needed, given if you look at where business is going, where workforce at work is going, et cetera. So these three vision statements are exceedingly important. And what's interesting to me is that this plan, if this plan had been done 20 years ago, it would not look like this. It would actually not have these three things in it. It would have been about K-12 education. And in fact, if the plan had been done 10 years ago, it would be quite about K-12. And in fact, if you look at the plan that was produced 5 years ago, it also didn't look like this. This plan is very broad, very ambitious, but as you'll also see, it's a plan that does not have the details of specifically what every agency is going to do. That's going to come next. This is really an aspirational plan of what the landscape should look like. So let's go on and look at the pathways now. Let's go to the next slide. So there are three pathways. This one's called develop and enrich strategic partnerships, cultivate new or strengthen existing connections between educational entities and the broader communities they serve. And as a side note, I would note that SIAC is a very interesting example where the development of SIAC, if this had been done 15 years ago, would have been all NASA agencies without the engagement of folks in the museum, folks like you are working on libraries. It would have been a purely NASA structure. But SIAC is not that. SIAC is a combination of inside agencies, in this case NASA, and players outside who actually work with the work of NASA. And so this is a good example of a strategic partnership, putting NASA with people that actually can deliver the outcomes and can have the audiences and can work with the various constituencies. So let's look at the three things that are under this partnership. The next slide will show you the three. Basically, foster STEM ecosystems that unite communities and workforce development. There's a great movement now towards this notion of STEM ecosystems. The fact that STEM is not just a province of K-12, It's a province of museums, it's a province of media, it's a province of libraries, it's a province of homes. And a realization in this plan very strongly puts a stake in the ground that says the ecosystem is what's important. Every one person doesn't do the whole job. It's all of the people playing that have an important role to play. That's really a new idea that's sort of gone into the concept of education, STEM education, in the last 3 to 5 years here in the United States. The second one is increased work-based learning and training through educator-employer partnerships. There's a very strong focus on looking at what employers are looking for and the relationship between employers and educators. And that's both in the formal sense, formal school system, but it's also, and whether it's a scientists being produced or technical workers being produced, but it's also in the informal side, an interest, and industry is actually more and more interested now in the non-formal K-12 side of work, and that might pertain to work you're doing in the libraries as well. And then the third one is basically blend, I've got to get rid of some face here, blend successful practices from across the learning landscape. So there's not a sense of that the work is invented at the federal level. The idea is to actually take ideas from anywhere and make use of them and have an interchange between people who know how to do this work outside the federal agencies, also inside, and have that be a blend or connections. And so there's a learning partnership here as well as a public partnership. Let's go on to the next slide. So pathways for success. This is the second one. Engage students where disciplines converge. Teach STEM as an interwoven and complex pursuit that blends disciplines and makes STEM learning meaningful and inspiring. This is a really interesting concept too, and it really is quite new. It's really saying that we're not actually looking at disciplinary education, physics, chemistry, math, the traditional kind that happened in school. That what's needed is people who actually are in much more of a convergence space, who are good at, say, biology and physics, or computers and biology, or systems analysis, or whatever. So it's very much not a pipeline plan to create more physicists or more chemists or that. It's really to say, look, we have to actually have students at a very early age deal with crossover areas of work. It's a very ambitious idea. Quite frankly, it's not going to happen instantly in the schools. You're not going to break down the departments at either the K-12 or, for that matter, at the university level. But it's aspirationally saying we need to do that. We need to have projects and people and learners that are actually much more willing to break boundaries and to learn that at a very early age. Next slide, please. So here are the three areas under here. There's advanced innovation and entrepreneurship education. This is sort of something that's really trying to push the idea of sort of disciplines that are about innovation, disciplines about engineering, disciplines about design thinking, which is a big new buzzword and an area that people are working in. Really pushing that and actually moving that into more of the educational system at an earlier time. The second is make mathematics a magnet. This was a fascinating component. I was actually quite surprised to see it come up. And it's really the argument that really should move into everyday mathematics that people want to do as opposed to mathematics that they may feel they need to do. Moving away from math as a gateway and much more making math as an everyday system. This is probably going to be somewhat controversial in the math education side of things. And then the last one, encourage transdisciplinary learning. There's a whole thing about interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary and then transdisciplinary. Transdisciplinary sort of means really crossovers where you're making use in one person of multiple transparencies, multiple learning opportunities. So again, a really new idea, and I think in education, particularly in the K-12 world, going to be quite not so easy to implement. Okay, let's go to the next one. The third pathway, build computational literacy. Ensure that STEM education is heavily imbued with computational skills and accessible through digital means. This one is a little bit of a grab bag. If we go to the next slide, you'll see what I mean. Computational literacy. One track here is digital literacy and cyber safety. It's really about a world that we hadn't actually taken into account in STEM education before. Here, the great push is to say everybody, students and adults, need to have a higher level of digital literacy and operate in that world with cyber safety, or at least a knowledge of the whole thing about what privacy is about and all of those issues. The second is making computational thinking an integral element of all education. So the real notion here, on one side, this could be learning coding and sort of computer languages. On the other side, it's really more, it can also be about just sequential processing, learning about programming language in general, also just thinking about using tools to actually make measurements, all of that sort of thing. So it's a very broad definition. That's why it's called computational thinking and not coding or something that tight. And then the last one, expand digital platforms for teaching and learning. This, of course, has been around in the agenda, the federal agenda and local and in everywhere else for a number of years. So this is actually not a new piece, but it's really sort of saying this is clearly coming. There's going to be even more of this in the future, and we need to pay attention to it. So if we go to the next slide, the fourth area, which is sort of a pathway, is an interesting one. It's called operate with transparency and accountability. And this comes about because there's a feeling that there has to be both a focus on evidence-based practices, not just assuming that you're just teaching a course or just printing up some photos of satellites or of planets and sending them out, but you actually have a reason why you're doing things. You have some evidence that this is a successful point. And then accountability really comes into play to really say, if you really say that you're really trying to meet those three goals, that the goal about workforce, the goal about diversity, the goal about public literacy, we have to see if that's happening. And one of the goals of our committee is going to be trying to figure out how we measure this activity. But it's really to say, yes, we have to actually show that we actually did the work. So if we go to the next slide, I think here are the four areas for this pathway. Basically, evidence-based practices are used by folks. They actually don't just start things because we think it's good, or that happened to me when I was in school, so of course it's good, but actually there's some evidence. There's a strong emphasis on reporting participation rates of underrepresented groups. And one of the things that the last plan got really dinged for was having no way to count or show that they've made any progress against this point. It's not easy to make progress because it's not easy to actually get this data, but Congress has said you've got to do this. And GAO, who did a study at the last report, said you didn't do it. So therefore, this is going to be a high on the list of people's expectation. Along with that, it's common metrics to measure progress. How do we actually know what progress is if we don't have metrics that we can actually compare and see changing? And finally, all of this becomes publicly available in one form or another. We go to the next slide. Here's what it all looks like on one piece of paper. You can see the pathways, you can see the objectives within the pathway, and then you can see this strange chart of all of the agencies and which ones they think they're working on. Now, actually, you could have probably, or there might have been an interest to put dots in every one of those boxes. But on the other hand, we know that sometimes some of this is actually working well and some not. So right now, what's happening is the agencies are developing their work plan, which they're going to present in the next few weeks, about how they're actually going to achieve this kind of work. And that work plan will actually then be something that we can then measure or look at in future time. Let's go to the next slide. This is just a list of the various things that have already happened through the administration. And it's sort of at this stage, I would say, just a bit of a grab bag of a list. And a lot of this is sort of doing things where there isn't actually new financial support, but there's actually just a recrafting of things that are in play that then get a different focus. For example, the Department of Education actually made STEM one of the priorities for their normal grant giving within their standard budget, and therefore STEM became moved up on the list. Next slide. Okay, so the last thing to say about this is that the plan was meant to be also a North Star, the new buzzword of direction, but not a bad one, which says that there's basically a plan that has shared vision. It's not necessarily just what the federal agencies are going to do. It's attempting to say this is what, in fact, the country should do. But as I mentioned earlier, this is the federal STEM plan, not the U.S. education plan, because as we know, the federal government is not involved in the educational enterprise. That's a states' rights system. And certainly with this administration, they take that very seriously, as does Congress, that's at least on one side of the party side. So they've talked about this more as a North Star, as a pointer, as a point of discussion, rather than a directive or dictatorial plan. And that's quite one thing that differentiates this possibly from the last plan that was done under a different administration and with a different set of players in Congress. Well, so I'm open to questions or thoughts that you guys have. If you want to think about what I talked about, if there's any of these issues you're interested in hearing about, please let me know. Yeah, and I would also say that some of this is unknown at this stage. The committee's met a couple times to purely review this plan and to begin. We're going to organize ourselves this summer with a session. We're going to have working groups that are going to work on each of those 4 pathways that I talked about. So I think what's going to happen is right now the federal agencies are actually, you notice there was nothing in here that says this will happen or that's going to happen. In the last plan, there was a lot of that. There's none of that in here. The federal agencies have been asked to say, what are you going to do? And so they put together a work plan that we expect to see come out in a month or so. And we're going to end up looking at it and talking about it this summer. Then when you have the work plan, you have to sort of see, well, how do you evaluate whether anyone's doing that? So that's going to, you have to wait sort of a year for that to happen. So we're going to have meetings later to sort of do the evaluation. In the meantime, we've been asked more to focus on the measurement, the metrics, and the transparency parts that I talked about last, and to try to figure out what we would recommend being used for these kinds of measures. And that's our task this summer, to sort of figure that out. This is all a bit complicated because, as you can read the news, you know that the budget process, the financial process, is a bit tortured in Washington right now, more tortured than even it usually is. And so what's going on is you can't actually say to an agency easily, because the administration's budget has actually been quite tight or negative, diminished in many of these places. And then Congress has been actually putting all the money back in that they feel should be there. So it's a little bit weird to talk to the agencies about new plans and programs when in fact they're also being collared at the moment by saying, well, we're going to do a lot with less because that's what we're supposed to do. And then they have to wait for the new budget to come out. So it's a little bit of chicken and egg going on here. So I think what's going to happen is going to become clearer this summer. In theory, the budget will get done in a more rapid fashion. The plans will be put in place, and then we'll actually be in a position of watching the implementation and commenting on it. The other role that we have as a committee, I think, is to do what I'm doing right here, which is to help people see the plan and understand it. And we've been giving presentations like this to other groups. I've been doing it with a museum group, for example. I did it for the SIAC group in general last fall. So I think we'll be doing that kind of work as well. And then we'll see how this plays out. Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the committee itself, I think the actual work that we'll do of any is probably around this assessment problem because it's sort of unsolved. What's happening with the diversity, though, which is quite interesting, is you may have heard of the NSF's Include project, INCLUDE, includes, I think there's an S at the end. That project has started under France Cordova, who's the director there, and it's been going now for 3 or 4 years, and it was really a program of assembling, getting a variety of different projects running, and then starting to assemble them as they learn from each other what's working and what's not working, and building up a knowledge exchange projects program so that it isn't all done independently. And includes turns out to be, seems to be working well. And so recently NASA signed on and said, we're going to also combine with NSF and take on includes. So they're going to do the same. They're going to be part of it. So there's a sharing all of a sudden between the agencies on a diversity plan. And my suggestion is to focus at the moment on includes and learn what it's about, learn what their parameters are, because I feel that that's going to become a major component of what happens with diversity within this work at the federal level. It's really about how to actually get knowledge about how best to do this into the places that are trying to do this, so that it isn't done halfway, but it is actually successful. Well, this is exactly what happened, and where the argument was made at the end of the last plan is this is very difficult because of privacy. And actually, Congress is saying, we want the numbers. They're actually not buying the privacy argument here. And there's some people who feel that that's just a smokescreen to not really give the data, and other people don't realize that you can't easily get this information. So the struggle you just talked about is a very real one, and yet. So the measures and metrics of this are tricky, and I feel that's one of the things we're going to be talking about this summer. I think there's a way through this. One has to really understand what is the data one's trying to find out, and then I think has to use some of the methodology that is used that is still fairly private, but it actually does get some data. You know, I mean, we get data out of the census, for example. It's kind of a interesting tortured process, but it does happen, and we get data from that tells us a lot about what's going on in aggregate, you know, rather than individual. So anyway, I think stay tuned for this one, and probably there'll be more knowledge by the summer about what some metrics might be that could work.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this was we had this discussion too. Convergence is the other problem that people really don't know, are not familiar with. But the notion of, usually what it's meant is interdisciplinary would mean between, you know, in between the disciplines, or having teams. And multidisciplinary typically has meant you get a person from, I don't know, a field A, and you get a person from field B, and you put them around the table, and you make sure that your outcome is actually valued by both of those. Transdisciplinary is really implying that within the individual, they're operating from multiple perspectives, or multiple of these old perspectives. They have a new perspective that's a combination of the old, so of many of the old. It's a funny word. It basically there's literature on this now, and there's some papers on it. There's been some articles in Science Magazine, etc. It's come up in other fields, particularly like in medicine. They talk somewhat about transdisciplinary. Another big deal is the relationship between engineering and science and math. In some ways, that this plan is pushing forward, rather than having them be separate. You take them all together. And I guess you could argue that transdisciplinary happens between, say, math and physics, because you have to kind of be conversant in both of those fields to be able to be a good scientist. But that's kind of what transdisciplinary really means here. And it's crossing over not only the traditional disciplines, but also even relations between art and science, for example, areas where people are functioning with a mixture of the ways of working from a variety of disciplines.
Yeah.
Again, the original plan, we saw a couple drafts earlier, and it was a little more of a grab bag of, you know, it sort of was what one might have expected, coding, or quite specific to the computer side. And you know, there were some initiatives, including from the federal level, about expanding that kind of work. I think I would say some saner people got into this and realized that it's actually a broader concept, which means it's really about procedural learning. You know, it's about procedural tasks. It's about doing this and then that. And that it's not necessarily that everybody learns how to be a good coder in 4th grade is going to make a difference. It's really about how you think in a logical sense and how you actually combine different things, you know, that would be involved, of course, in coding, but also just involved in how you think about dealing with big data. How do you deal with, you know, even big data, visual data? It's about computational thinking. How do you have visualizations of data so you can actually understand what it is? So it's quite a broad idea now, I think, in terms of some people's minds. And, you know, it's also like, you know, taking measurements, doing things that are have been more traditionally thought of maybe in the science domain in terms of data gathering as well as in the computational domain. And I know that we're actually at the Exploratorium trying to work on stuff in the world of making and tinkering where you actually are driven by wanting to do something. So therefore you need to actually learn how to do some procedural coding as opposed to just learning coding and then looking for something interesting to do with the fact that you know coding. Yeah, we didn't hear in this discussion. I think the closest it got to were some of the areas, interestingly enough, around design thinking, which is, you know, a slight, maybe a cousin to the STEAM idea, which has to do with thinking about design and which as a part of engineering, but also as a part of visualization and creativity on that side. But I do think that the other thing that was maybe a year ago, there was a National Academy of Sciences report that came out, which was really about art and its relation to research, science research, engineering research, and the critical notion that at university levels, there should be a combination of art and science in the work, in the lab work, in the research work, in the laboratory innovation side itself. And it's a very interesting report. I would recommend, if you're interested in the topic, to go get it and read it. There was also a Sackler symposium on this whole topic last March or April, I think it was, based on rehab of the Cybernetic Serendipity show, which happened in 1968-69. So I think that there's a lot of discussion here. What's interesting is it's a discussion which some people get and realize, and then some people view art as separate, and so it hasn't shown up in STEM. Maybe because it's not STEAM, it's STEM still, but I think it's coming. And frankly, if you look at it at some of these topics, it definitely fits into some of the topics I talked about. So, and I also think, you know, art has a variety. I think art is a great parallel coming from the Exploratorium. I'd have to say, is art is a great parallel. And both artists and scientists are great inquirers. So I think that side is really good for STEAM. But I also feel that the relationship to design and visualization is also a really important part. And it would actually could play that out in the libraries too, with the two tools that are available now in computers. And actually the UK actually had a much stronger design component to their K-12 educational side for many years. And I always felt we missed it here in the US. There's some evidence, in fact, say just the field of science, that the kinds of things that say happen in gifted and talented programs in terms of students who become very good at, who come through that program, where they actually misses a variety of features that are important in the scientific enterprise: visual thinking, you know, hands, mechanical, building tools, building devices. And so having I think adding STEAM into the work that you're doing, it could be a really great thing. And you might start just on the design side as much as on the artistic side, so to speak.